Today is January 24th, 2026. I want to address a claim made recently by Donald Trump, a claim about NATO's role in Afghanistan. He suggested that NATO forces were not useful, that they stayed far from the front lines. Now, that may sound like a throwaway remark, but it isn't. It's a statement that collapses 2 decades of complex multinational military engagement into a single misleading idea. And in doing so, it distorts both history and present reality. When political figures speak casually about military alliances, the consequences rarely stop with the moment. Words shape public understanding, they influence diplomatic trust, and over time, they recalibrate what people come to accept as true. This matters, especially now, because the international environment is under strain. Europe is facing renewed instability. Authoritarian states are more assertive, and the systems designed to prevent escalation are being tested. In that context, dismissive rhetoric about alliances like NATO isn't just inaccurate, it's strategically reckless. One of the most persistent myths about Afghanistan is that NATO's role was marginal, that it was little more than an accessory to an American war. It's true that the United States led the initial invasion. It's true that it bore the largest share of resources and casualties. But that does not justify the conclusion that other NATO members were insignificant. From 2003 onwards, NATO assumed command of the International Security Assistance Force. Troops from dozens of countries were deployed across Afghanistan, often in volatile regions, often under difficult conditions. British, Canadian, German, Dutch, Danish, Polish, Italian forces, among others, were involved in combat operations, stabilization efforts, and the training of Afghan security forces. Casualties were real, and they were not evenly distributed. To suggest that these forces remained far from the front lines misunderstands how modern coalition warfare actually works. There is rarely a single front. Instead, there are layered responsibilities: combat, logistics, intelligence, air support, training, reconstruction. Coalition warfare is slower, more bureaucratic, more constrained. But those constraints are not evidence of irrelevance. They are the price of legitimacy. Much of the criticism of NATO's involvement in Afghanistan rests on an assumption that deserves questioning. That assumption is this: that the intervention should be judged primarily on whether it produced a stable liberal democracy. By that measure, it failed. There's no point pretending otherwise. But the expectation itself was always unrealistic. Afghanistan is a deeply fragmented society, shaped by geography, tribal structures, external interference, and decades of conflict. Judging the intervention solely on its most ambitious aims risks missing the more limited but still consequential outcomes. During the period of sustained international presence, large-scale terrorist training camps were disrupted. Urban security improved in many areas. Access to education, particularly for girls, expanded dramatically compared with Taliban rule. Infrastructure projects, however uneven, enabled basic economic activity. Afghan security forces, though ultimately unable to hold the state together, were better trained and equipped than any previous national force. None of this erases the strategic errors. None of it excuses civilian casualties or corruption, and none of it changes the catastrophic collapse that followed withdrawal. But it does complicate the claim that NATO's role was meaningless. History rarely offers such clean verdicts. What makes Trump's comments particularly troubling is not only their inaccuracy, but their effect. Alliances depend on shared understanding. They rely on mutual recognition of contribution and sacrifice. When influential figures imply that allies did little or nothing, they weaken that foundation, both at home and abroad. NATO's deterrent power rests on credibility, on the belief that commitments are reciprocal, that they are taken seriously. Undermining that belief does not require a formal withdrawal. It begins with skepticism, then hesitation, and eventually fragmentation. States hedge. They seek alternatives. They accommodate pressure rather than resist it. And the result is not greater independence, but greater vulnerability. Much of this rhetoric is rooted in a broader resurgence of isolationist thinking. The idea that national security can be preserved by disengagement, that global commitments are optional. It's an emotionally appealing argument, especially in times of economic strain and political fatigue. But it's also historically naive. In an interconnected world, instability does not stay put. Conflicts generate refugee flows. They disrupt trade, they affect energy markets, they create security vacuums. The costs of alliance participation are visible and immediate. The costs of alliance erosion are delayed, diffuse, and often misattributed. That imbalance makes cooperation easy to criticize, right up until its absence becomes impossible to ignore. None of this is to suggest that NATO is beyond criticism. Decision-making is slow. Internal politics are complex. Burden sharing is uneven. These are genuine problems. But NATO provides something no single state can replicate alone: a framework for collective security that binds democratic nations into a shared strategic culture. It creates habits of cooperation, interoperability, consultation. And when it works, it deters conflict not by guaranteeing peace, but by raising the cost of aggression. Judging NATO solely by its performance in Afghanistan, one of the most difficult environments imaginable, is a category error. Alliances are not designed to produce ideal outcomes. They exist to prevent worse ones. The intervention in Afghanistan was flawed, costly, and ultimately unsuccessful in its most ambitious aims. What is indefensible is rewriting history to suggest that coalition efforts were irrelevant or that Allied contributions were negligible. At a time when international cooperation is under strain, accuracy matters, language matters, and respect for institutional reality matters. NATO endures not because it is perfect, but because the alternatives are worse. Undermining it with careless rhetoric may offer short-term political satisfaction, but the long-term consequences are rarely borne by those who make the remarks.